Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we are going to discuss the organizing principles of radical feminism, and also we're going to take a look at the article by Freeman, The Tyranny of Structurelessness. It's going to be discussed by Lierre Keith and Brew, and towards the end we're going to also add Sheila Jeffries and Marian Rutigliano to discuss a bit about structure. So welcome everybody, and thank you. We're going to start off with Lierre presenting. So over to you, Lierre.
Okay, we got to do this screen share business. Let's see. Come on. Nope, wrong one. Hang on. Let me go back a screen. Now I don't know what I'm doing.
It's fine. We're just
we did it so good in the rehearsal. All right, I'm going to start over. There we go. That's the one I want.
This is the tyranny of computing.
Okay. There, yes, exactly. The tyranny of computing. Can you all see that? Just somebody say yes.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. All right. Okay, so you've heard of speed dating. Well, I call this speed revolution, and I have to go through this pretty quickly. So it's super speedy. Liberalism is idealist, and that means that social reality for them is made up of attitudes and ideas. So it's an event that happens in the mind. And in this world, social change happens through rational argument and education. But over on the radical side, materialism, that means that society is organized by concrete systems of power. It's not by thoughts and ideas, but by material institutions. The solution to oppression is to take those systems apart. So liberals will say, we have to educate, educate, educate. And the radicals say, well, actually, we have to stop them. So I've got that highlighted there at the bottom. Is organized political resistance compels social change. What this means is that power is not a mistake. It's not a misunderstanding. It's not a disagreement. Justice is not won by argument, by individual transformation, or by spiritual epiphany. It's won by taking power away from the powerful and dismantling their institutions. Here's Frederick Douglass saying the same thing. Power concedes nothing without a demand. Never has, never will. And our job is to be that demand. And here's our Christabel saying the same thing. We know that relying solely on argument, we wandered for 40 years politically in the wilderness. We know that arguments are not enough and that political force is necessary. So I will repeat, justice is not won by argument, by individual transformation, or by spiritual epiphany. It's won by taking power away from the powerful and dismantling their institutions. The question is how to do that. How do we apply political force when we have nothing? We don't have, I don't know what I've written here, sorry. Okay, we don't have enough power to make our oppressors concede to our demands. So how do we get it? Gene Sharp is the foremost theorist of nonviolent direct action. His entire life was devoted to researching this particular technique and then teaching people to use it. He's responsible for more revolutions than anyone else in history, and I include in that Karl Marx. So a lot of his presentation is based on his work. Most of us think that this is the nature of political power. Okay, it's implacable. You can swap out rulers, but you can't change it. So you can do things like election or a coup, but you're not actually changing the nature of that power. And power can only be reduced by using violence. So that's mostly what people think about when they think about political power, is sort of vaguely how we all think that this works. But in reality, every time that people use nonviolence to overthrow a dictator or protect a legitimate government from a coup, we can see that this isn't true. This is not the nature of political power. The rulers depend on the submission of the ruled. By withdrawing that consent, the oppressed can control and eventually destroy the power of the rulers. And nonviolent action is a technique used to control, combat, and destroy the opponent's power by nonviolent means of wielding power. So why do people obey? How do they get consent? That's the obvious question. And there's a list of reasons. So one is habit, and that's the main reason. People generally just don't question their superiors. Habitual obedience is embedded in all cultures, and really that's what a culture is. It's habitual behavior. Fear of sanctions, and it's important to note it's the fear of sanctions rather than the sanctions themselves that is the most effective in enforcing obedience. They don't have to burn every woman as a witch. Once in a while, they have to burn one of us. That's enough to control the entire population. Moral obligation, there's an inner constraining power that's the product of cultural programming, deliberate indoctrination by these various institutions. There's self-interest, the potential for financial gain and enhanced prestige can entice people to obey. And this is women begging for male approval. The psychological identification with the ruler, this is huge. People feel an emotional tie with the leader or with the system. They experience its victories and defeats as their own. Feminists developed an entire concept called the woman-identified woman. We want women to put women at the center of the frame, at the center of our concern. Instead of men, we want women to be there. And when you do that, the world looks a whole lot different. Then you have the zones of indifference. People often obey commands without consciously questioning the legitimacy of those demands. And then ultimately the absence of self-confidence. And this is learned helplessness. People feel inadequate, usually because they've been humiliated, traumatized, or otherwise punished. And so the traumatized psyche then polices itself. When analyzing human obedience, the psychological factor is decisive. Domination and submission are psychological states of mind. Our job is to turn submission into courage. So how? Well, first we have to understand that the basic dichotomy of social and political behavior is between action and inaction. It's not between nonviolence and violence. It's between those who do something and those who will never do anything. So one big understanding about nonviolent direct action, it is not negotiation, it is not verbal appeals to the opponent. Nonviolent action is force. That force can be social, economic, political. And here's an example. Asking an employer for a wage increase is an act of verbal persuasion. You may get your raise. That's great. Problem solved. A refusal to work until a wage increase is granted is a case of nonviolent action. It's combat. Nonviolent action has more in common with war than with milder, peaceful responses to conflicts. Nonviolent action is a means of combat. It involves the matching of forces and the waging of battles. It requires the wise strategy and tactics. It demands of its soldiers courage, discipline, and sacrifice. The understanding that nonviolent action is a form of active combat is diametrically opposed to the popular assumption that nonviolent action relies on rational persuasion of the opponent or that it consists of passive submission. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nonviolent action is not inaction. Nonviolent direct action is just what it says. It's action, which is nonviolent. So NVDA can be used to achieve reforms or specific objective. Here are the four young men, they were still teenagers, they were 18, 19 years old, who kicked off the lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. Now I could talk for an hour about their brilliant use of NVDA. One thing to note was that they had all been trained at Highlander, the Highlander Folk School, which was the kind of the brain, the nerve center of the civil rights movement. All the luminaries of the civil rights movement had been through Highlander. So Rosa Parks, MLK, Ralph Abernathy, all of these guys, the Freedom Riders, they were all trained at Highlander. We don't have a Highlander, and we need one. I would say we had some informal Highlanders, but those actions, those places, those activities ended a long time ago. And I speak here as somebody who went both to Greenham Common and to the Seneca Women's Peace Camp. When we had our own trainings, we had our own way of teaching each other how to do this. And those institutions just didn't last. So we've lost the transmission, our capacity to transmit this information and these trainings. Nonviolent direct action can be used to destroy whole empires. So this is the Berlin Wall coming down. Those of you who weren't around for this, it was an amazing day. It was an amazing thing to witness. It can also be used to bring down dictators. So this is the Philippines. Marcos was a brutal dictator who ruled the Philippines for 20 years. His main opponent was a senator named Benigno Aquino, and he was murdered by Marcos. Everyone knew it was murder. And his widow, Cory Aquino, stepped up to run against Marcos in the election. That election was marked by massive fraud and violence. Aquino gave a great speech in Manila where she laid out a 7-part program of nonviolent resistance. She basically said, we can get this done, and here's how. She clearly knew what she was doing. She urged everyone to be creative in resistance and, quote, experiment with nonviolent forms of protest. Eventually, the senior military officials defected from Marcos, and that's when these struggles really tipped toward the people. It's an extremely important tactic. It's called fraternizing. You want all the people with guns, the military, the police, to see you as human and to know that they are welcome to join the resistance. And some of them did. They holed up in the Department of Defense building and said they would rather die than continue to serve under Marcos. And at that point, so this is a deeply Catholic country. The radio station, they had a Catholic radio station, and they put out the call to defend the military people. So the civilians were urged to surround the building and protect them, and they did. Thousands of people fled into the streets, and they set up essentially a festival for 2 days. It's very joyful resistance, knowing what was coming. And of course, Marcos does eventually send in his Marines with tanks. So it's very moving. I mean, we all watched this live on television. The priests and the nuns came, and they stood between the tanks and the civilians. And none of those Marines could open fire when they were told to. They just couldn't do it. So Marcos's power completely collapsed at that point, and he had to flee the country. So this was live on television, a really great use of nonviolent direct action. NVDA can also be used to defend a legitimate government under attack. This is Prague, spring 1968. This is one of the best examples of what's called a civilian-based defense. Gene Sharp wrote a whole book with that title. Well worth diving into. The Soviets sent in 500,000 troops with some of the most modern military equipment that they had. They thought it would take 4 days to conquer. It took 8 months. The whole country used some incredible nonviolent resistance, including that fraternizing. They used sabotage, they used defiance of all kinds. And one of the problems was that they had no actual leadership, so there was no overall plan. The resistance was mostly read by the radio stations, which is interesting, but they tended to be spontaneous actions with no overarching goals or strategy. So in the end, they were defeated, but only temporarily. 1989, they finally won their independence during what was called the Velvet Revolution, which peacefully ended the communist regime. Nonviolent action impinges upon an opponent's power more directly than would violence. That's because nonviolent action is capable of striking at the sources of the ruler's political power. So that list from earlier, the habit, the fear of sanctions, the self-interest, he only has power because we give it to him. Political violence is present in any hierarchical society where status, wealth, and decision-making power are concentrated in an elite willing to use violence to maintain their dominance. Political violence is expressed directly in assaulting and imprisoning people, but more importantly, in the threat of prison, assault, torture, all of that. It doesn't have to happen all that often to enforce our consent. So this is the Children's Crusade. When a system characterized by structural violence is challenged, the basic nature of the system is clearly revealed. So the Children's Crusade was launched in Birmingham, Alabama, on May 2nd, 1963. The movement had essentially run out of adults who could afford to lose their jobs and join the struggle. The children stepped up. And it was not just high school students, it was also junior high school students. Some of these kids were 13 years old. The stated purpose of the march was to walk downtown to the mayor and talk to him about how bad segregation was. That's the stated purpose. The strategic goal, and this is a quote, the goal get a reaction from the racist officials that would not only spotlight the injustice of the South, but gain national attention and support. So understand, the goal was not to get safely from point A to point B. The goal was not to stay safe. The goal was to get a reaction from racist officials that would make the structural violence visible. Over 1,000 students skipped school and started to march. Hundreds were arrested and jailed. More kids started to march the next day, and Bull Connor, who was a hideous human being, he was the police commissioner, he directed the local police and fire departments to use force. So images of children being blasted by fire hoses, clubbed by police officers, and attacked by a police dog appeared on television. The world was outraged. Not one of those kids broke their nonviolent discipline, not one. The fire hoses, it's 120 pounds of pressure per square inch. There were also photographs put up that it took the bark off of trees. Okay, that's how hard that water was, and these kids didn't break. The crusade ended after intervention from the Justice Department. So this is the federal government has to intervene. President Kennedy finally had to express support for federal civil rights legislation, and he did give a very moving speech, but this is what led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You put yourself in danger on purpose. You have to make the structural violence visible. It requires incredible courage and potential sacrifice, so it's not for everybody, but you make the violence visible. The violence is already there. It's the actionist's task to let the public see it. Nonviolent action strips the sanctity from the law and compels the application of sanctions, thus converting domination to naked force. The violence on which the system depends is revealed in unmistakable terms. The nonviolent challenge has not created, but revealed that violence. A perfect example brought to you by the suffrage movement. The violence was there. Male violence is ubiquitous, we know this. The women made it visible. A great deal of courage and sacrifice is required to make nonviolent direct action work. So now I'm going to tell you something delightful that I only found out this week. There is a direct connection between the suffragists and the Greensboro Four that sit in Greensboro. So Ezel Blair was one of those 4 young men who did that. And there's a wonderful interview with him where, of course, he's asked, how did you get involved with this? Why did you want to do this? And he said that when he was young, he was really, really interested in anything to do with current events, the news. He would sit and watch TV, listen to the radio, whatever. And he loved anything about history. So this documentary came on. He was a young kid. This documentary came on that was about Gandhi. He'd never heard of Gandhi. And this is this moment, right, where you get not just a role model, but it's sort of a moment when you realize you can enter the story. There's this epic narrative and you get to be part of it. And he says he was glued to the TV. And this is his exact words. A little skinny brown-skinned guy with a diaper wrapped around him led a movement for independence. I was only 106 pounds. Maybe I could do something like that too. So he's completely inspired by Gandhi. Now, as radical feminists, we know that Gandhi was a terrible misogynist, but he was also, as well, a brilliant political strategist. So he's one of those people we have to pirate, right? We have to go in there and loot what was good out of what he did. And Gandhi, a lot of people don't know, Gandhi learned a lot of what he knew from the suffragists. He actually subscribed to 3 different London newspapers because he wanted to keep up on what they were doing. He was so intrigued by their brilliant use of this technique. So this was one of his inspirations, and he learned a tremendous amount directly from Christabel Pankhurst. So we've got this flow here across history. We've got our Christabel, we've got Gandhi, and then we have the Greensboro Four. It's an absolute direct line, and I just think that's delightful. So anyway, here's our suffragists doing their thing. Gene Sharp called this political jujitsu. By forcing the system to react with violence, the actionists alienate the regime from its supporters. They promote greater solidarity and resistance within the subordinate group. They arouse the opinion of third parties against the regime. So people who didn't have an opinion or were trying to stay out of it, they can't anymore. And they demonstrate that not even violent repression can compel submission. Here's another example. This is Liberia. Women there put an end to an absolutely brutal and seemingly endless civil war. A refusal to submit to the repression while maintaining nonviolent discipline is crucial for the technique to work. So you don't submit, you meet them head on. When they escalate, so do you. But you cannot switch to violence. Nonviolent discipline is the fulcrum. Nonviolent action doesn't work because it's moral or because it's spiritually superior in some way. It works because it exposes the violence and demystifies power. It breaks through the psychology of the oppressed. It ultimately removes the support on which the powerful depend. And that's our consent. It removes that. So this is the chart that we have in our book, Deep Green Resistance. This is a huge spectrum of all the different kinds of political activism. And we called this our taxonomy of action. So we think we're here. We are essentially, we think that we are simply expressing our basic civil rights and that shouldn't be a problem. And in a normal world, that wouldn't be a problem. We've long since won the right to gather in public, to express our opinions in public. In the United States, that's called the First Amendment. There's a reason it's first, because it's absolutely crucial to a functioning democracy. We have to have that politically. We have to have that as part of our civic religion, it's been called. And so we think we're here. We think we're still doing this. And of course, we have a right to do that. So, I don't blame us for thinking that this is where we are, but it's not where we are. We're actually here. We are essentially doing civil disobedience when we gather in public. We don't know that, and we haven't been trained for it. And this is why I feel a great deal of urgency about the current situation. I don't think we have enough collective understanding as a movement to even make a decision about whether to use this technique or not. So I'm trying my hardest to get this information out there. If I've learned anything over this last wretched decade, it's that we never should have taken any of this for granted. Basics like the First Amendment, every citizen's right to gather, to petition our government, to speak in some way that is socially meaningful. Women have lost all of that to the genderists, to a men's sexual rights movement. So there are people who have studied this technique, and there are people around the world who have used it with great success. And I mean millions of people. We need to learn from those people, and then we need to be those people. So this is the Baltic Way, or the Baltic Chain. August 23rd, 1989, 2 million people joined hands to form a human chain. It spanned 430 miles across the 3 Baltic states. They were brutally occupied by the Soviet Union, and the Baltic Way drew global attention. It's been described as an emotionally captivating and visually stunning event. In fact, it could be seen from outer space. That's how huge it was. In the study that Sharp's Institute did about the Latvian resistance, there's this wonderful anecdote. The resistance is building, people are joining, but none of them have any idea what to do now, how to actually strategize a way to win their independence. And then one of their comrades comes running into their tiny little office, and he's waving a book. There's a plan. Someone has a plan. He's found Gene Sharp's work. We can do this. So everyone who spoke even a tiny bit of English was pressed into service. They translated as they typed, and they didn't even have computers. It was actual typewriters. And everyone else photocopied, they collated, they stapled, and then they went out into public. Everywhere that people gathered, they distributed these photocopies to anyone who would take one, urging them to read and follow the plan, to understand the necessity of using nonviolent resistance to spread the word across the entire Baltic region. And they did it. They won their independence back. It was done almost entirely without loss of life. And there's a great film about the Estonian struggle. It's called The Stinging Revolution, which I highly recommend. It explains in detail how they did this. So history hands you a moment. You have to be ready to use it. Nonviolent direct action does not work because it's moral. It doesn't work by niceness. It doesn't work by converting the enemy. You may convert some of them, and that's a moment to look for, but that's not how it works. It's a matching of forces. It works by force. It makes the structural violence visible, which means it won't work if we behave as badly as they do. If we behave as badly, nothing is made visible to anyone. The violence, the threats, the contempt, the insults, the screaming, the degrading imagery, all of it has to come from their direction, not ours. I'm not saying it's easy, because it's not, but this technique is our only chance. We have no money, no power, no mass media, no internet giants, no political party. Nonviolent direct action was made for people in exactly our situation. It's our only chance. This is little Ruby Bridges single-handedly desegregating the Louisiana public school system. If a 6-year-old child can carry herself with this kind of courage and dignity day after day, so can we. She and her parents knew what was likely to be required of her, and she got it done. This technique requires tremendous sacrifice, but freedom isn't free. This technique requires tremendous sacrifice because it's war. You have to go in armed, not with physical weapons, but with emotional readiness and a strong determination to stay calm, respectful, and courageous, no matter what they bring. Now, you can find lots of guidelines, different versions of nonviolent statements, but they're always very direct behavioral guidelines. That's for a reason. Nonviolent discipline is not about niceness. It's not about politeness. It's not some vague sense of being good. It's a very precise form of combat, and it requires warriors. We have our own pledge of nonviolence. Wolf, WDI USA, Sovereign Women Speak. We're all using this pledge for our future direct actions. This is a quote from the end of it. Participants in this action hereby pledge to nonviolence in our speech and action. This is not a call to love our enemy. It is a call to fight him with the best weapon we have, his own violence. We will let the world see these men for who they are. We will bring our righteous rage, our love for women and girls, and our unbreakable determination, and turn them to the only strategy that can win us justice. I hope I have conveyed the general outline of this technique. Our movement too needs a plan, and this is my offering, and we will as ever end with Andrea. Feminism requires precisely what patriarchy destroys in women: unimpeachable bravery in confronting male power. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lierre. That was just unbelievable. I've been sort of active feminist for so long, and then I sort of think, oh, I've heard everything, but I just learned so much from that. It makes it more clear to me where we are and what we need to do. And there's just loads in there that I had not really thought through clearly. So I'm going to share this when we get it up on YouTube really widely. Yeah, it's just brilliant. So there's a lot in there, and I think we probably, well, we're not going to have enough time today in the next 30 minutes to go into everything, but we'll come back to it over the next weeks and months. And it looks as if this is giving us an idea of what we can do now, where we can go, and it's really answering a lot of questions that have been knocking around in the women's movement over the last couple of weeks, months. What should we be doing, and what strategies should we be having? Now, when we planned this, we decided we would also talk about this article, The Tyranny of Structurelessness. So we're going to go ahead, and I'm going to sort of just summarize what's in it, and then we're going to get Marian, Rutigliano, and Sheila Jeffries on screen in about 10 minutes to discuss some of the ideas that have come out of mostly what Lierre said, but also this. So The Tyranny of Structurelessness, written by Joe Freeman, was written, I think, in about 1986, and I'm sorry I haven't got the actual date. Oh, no.
It was earlier. It was way earlier.
1970.
Yeah.
Yeah, 1970. Right, so by Joe Freeman, and it was first printed by the Women's Liberation Movement USA, and then has been republished many, many, many times. Now, what this article, it's very, very short, it's sort of about 5 A4 pages, says is that, well, she was addressing a problem that had happened at that stage in 1970 in the Women's Liberation Movement, that there were a lot of unstructured consciousness raising groups, and that there was a sort of feeling in the women's liberation movement that structures were necessarily bad, and that the best way for us to work as a women's movement was to be completely structureless and non-hierarchical. And you can imagine, or maybe have experienced, consciousness raising groups where everybody's completely equal and every idea is valid. You just go around the room all discussing your insights, and then there's not even really a moderator, it's just sort of discussed. Now, what she said in the Tyranny of Structurelessness, as an partly, well, out of frustration that this was happening, was that there's no such thing as a structureless group. Now, if a group, so this is a quote from her, there's no such thing as a structureless group, that there are always structures in groups, and that groups will have either seen or unseen structures. So there can be an informal structure, maybe because of friends or because of political opinion or because of lifestyle or geographical location. But those structures exist to get things done in groups. So you might have a structureless group that says it's non-hierarchical and non-formed, it's just people turn up. But what happens behind the scenes is that people work together and often then can lead groups. So you have this de facto leadership that isn't spoken about. And if there's a collective commitment to structurelessness, then there's a sort of awkward problem that people are trying to pretend there isn't a structure, but there is a structure. And then a lot of tensions emerge. She said that the women's movements often accuse other women of being elitist, and that there's a sort of drive, I suppose, because of not wanting to replicate patriarchy, to look for women who are being treated as elite or are behaving in an elitist way as a sort of better than, to be very critical of that. And she says that that's difficult because there will be specialization, there will be people who know what to do, or maybe are good at speaking, or have organized a lot of things. And so to be just sort of constantly complaining about elitism isn't helpful to the movement. Another thing she says in the article is, she says there's a star system. So if you have structurelessness, no structures, then you end up just emerges women who become stars. And then if there is no structure, those stars often say, I am not responsible to the women's movement, and I'm not in the women's movement, I am not a feminist. And that means that we then might have a star who is sort of being listened to, but does not bond or is not linked to the movement, and is not it doesn't have to report to the women's movement, and maybe is not, it starts to feel like detached. So then there's a breakdown of our political organizing capability. And so that's a sort of problem. And then there is the problem of that person becoming individual and being asked to be a spokesperson for the women's movement, like Germaine Greer was a few years ago, where she said something about rape, like it's not too bad being raped. And then the mainstream media said to her, but how can you say that? You're representing the feminist movement. And she said, no, I'm not a feminist. I've never said I was a feminist, and I'm not representing anyone. So whilst she's done lots of great things, she was acting as a sort of star, not embedded in the movement. And Joe Freeman talks about the problem of that. Then she goes on to political impotence. So if you don't have a structure, and you don't know what you're doing, and you don't have links to who's speaking, that they are actually linked up to the movement, then you can not get very far politically. And she said that one thing is, if there isn't a plan, It says, when a group has, this is her speaking, Jo Freeman, when a group has no specific task and consciousness raising is a task, the people in it turn their energies to controlling others in the group. This is not done so much out of a malicious desire to manipulate others, although sometimes it is, as out of a lack of anything better to do with their talents. So it's a point that if you're not doing something, and we are, then you can actually turn those that energy onto controlling other people and criticizing. Then she says, another quote, the end of consciousness raising leaves people with no place to go, and the lack of structure leaves them with no way of getting there. And one of the reasons it's interesting for us to read this article by Jo Freeman is it seems to me we're in the same place now. We've done the consciousness raising that we had to do because of the transgender ideology. We are active, we've formed, there's loads of us in movement getting ready to do something, but so we've done our consciousness raising at this moment in history, but we're not certain what we're going to do next. And we haven't got a very good, clear structure. Maybe we have some structures, but we're not that certain. And we might be left with no way of getting there. So we're sort of, that's useful. We can start to think about that. What are we going to do? What structure do we want to have? So there's another, I think I'll just say that the other thing, she talks a little bit more, she's very, very clear about the problems. And then she comes up with some answers, and she says that we could use some of the principles of democratic structuring that would come from the left, a lot of them. So delegation, you choose a delegate, people need to be responsible, distribution of authority, rotation of tasks, allocation of tasks along rational criteria, diffusion of information, and equal access to resources. Now, as you read those, many of us have lived that and tried it and used lots of those ideas, and we continually are trying it. So I suppose I would say if you haven't read it, it's worth reading, and we're hoping now that we'll be able to build on that and maybe come up with some new, even better solutions. So I'm now going to see if I'm going to ask Marian and Sheila to come on. That should work, and then we'll just have a sort of 20-minute discussion. We've got much too much to do in 20 minutes, but we'll get started on these ideas. So let's go to Sheila first. So Sheila, what do you think, or what's come up?
Well, there was so much in Lierre's talk, because basically she was giving, and this is absolutely crucial because there's huge numbers of women becoming feminists now who are not aware of this history, some of the history of the crucial forms of organising and transformation that have happened, which we've lost to a large extent. I think there's a lot more pessimism now, I really do. So that's absolutely crucial. And that helps to inspire us and make us realise that we have to think about how we're going to do all of this en masse. It's not just a question of a bit of poster making, although poster making is very important. We've got to do something en masse here if we possibly can. But there's so much there, and I don't want to go into that in particular, because I did say a few things in the chat about these are wonderful ideas, and we need to work out how it's best to adapt them for feminists, because obviously there are huge differences in the situation that women are in versus men. But I don't want to get into that in huge detail now, because I'd rather say a little bit about the tyranny of structurelessness issue. And there's a huge amount in there too. I think we're going to start and we're going to go on with all of this, which is great. I read that paper, I think, in the 70s, and it became crucially relevant to me when in the early 80s. In 1980, in London, with some other women, I set up a group called Women Against Violence Against Women, which mainly concentrated on opposing sexually violent films and pornography. Within a few years, there were 30 or 40 groups all over the UK, huge numbers of actions going on, really, really, really important group. And it became terribly popular. We'd had about 40 women to a meeting every Wednesday night. It was hugely important. And then quite a lot of trouble started. And part of the trouble was that because we had no structure, and of course anybody could come, and that was crucial. It was marvelous to see all these new women coming. But I, and indeed Linda Bellos at that time, came to be seen as very dominating in the group, because of course we were involved in setting it up, but we had a lot of the ideas and so on, and it became very difficult for us, and we did experience quite a lot of attacks upon us, and we used to call it killing the mothers. You know, whoever sets something up will eventually get killed, metaphorically speaking. We did get driven out in about 1983, 84, and after that the group fairly quickly stuttered and stumbled. That may have happened anyway. So I'm very aware of that. And that's happened thereafter many times over my political career when I've been involved in setting up groups. This problem has occurred because if groups are entirely open, women can come into them, sometimes women whose mental health is not very good. I think we have to admit that. Sometimes women who actually seek for themselves to have a little bit of power, because women don't. I mean, women are enormously oppressed. The idea that they can come along and be listened to and be influential is enormously important. So we have to, you know, bear all these things in mind. But the problem is that groups can very easily be destroyed. I remember I was in the late 70s, I was in a group called the Patriarchy Studies Group, which was a lot of women who were doing PhDs and things, who were kind of academic. And we were doing theory of patriarchy, and we met every 6 weeks in somebody's home. It was a great group, and we'd spend a whole weekend just talking, tremendously exciting. And then one woman in the group decided that she didn't like what was going on. She phoned around everybody so that in ahead of a certain meeting, she'd got them all to agree that we were going in the wrong direction. And the wrong direction was concentrating too much on studying male sexuality. Isn't that interesting? I don't think we were wrong to be doing that, obviously, since I've done it for the rest of my life. So I turned up for this weekend. I and my closest friends had no idea that a coup had happened, but a coup had happened. And we were told that if you wanted to study male sexuality, you should do it in some kind of strange way that was nothing obviously to do with sex, and we were wrong. Actually, we stayed together and we produced a book, The Patriarchy Papers, and in fact, the analysis we were producing has been enormously influential. So that has happened to me over and over and over again in groups that I've been where there's no structure. But then, of course, we rejected structure in terms of the structure of the left. If you think about now what's happening in the Labour Party in the UK, there wouldn't be much point being a feminist, I don't think, trying to be in there right now on transgenderism or any other issue. So we rejected that kind of structure because women didn't do very well in it, and men organized these structures and controlled them. So what do you do if being open to everybody can have its problems? And left-type structures are a difficulty for obvious reasons, because they can be used to keep opposing positions out in a very fundamental way. Like in the Women's Liberation Conferences back in the 70s, when there used to be 3,000 women sometimes at a conference, the group that set up the conference, it was a different one each time, would of course have control over what came onto the agenda. And so we did a little kind of book title at the time, a funny book title, which was called Drawing Up the Conference Agenda by I. Levi-Tout, after I. Levi-Strauss, who was an important figure at the time. So we were very aware of the ways in which these structures worked to keep particular ideas out. It is all happening again now, I fear. All of those problems are tending to come back. I can't say, you know, that I have the answers to this, because I don't, and I don't want to go on too long. I always used to be accused of going on too long in the old days.
But that's there is a lot to say. So let's go to Marian and see what you thought of the talks, and well, mostly Lierre's, but yeah, but the Joe Freeman article.
You know, the concept of structure, structurelessness, and hierarchy. I mean, we go back to what, you know, radical feminism is a class analysis, and the structure of oppressors, men on the top and women on the bottom of a hierarchy. So I think there is if we understand that, and even if we don't, a sensation of that's what women's lives are like. But you know, if you're prisoner, and some of this, and when Lierre spoke, and you know, in what Joe wrote, there's just this flavor of like you know, the enemy and military terms and things like that, which sometimes really rub women the wrong way. But there are some things about that that are analogous, that really speak to how we are oppressed in a hierarchy. I mean, if you're a prisoner, and that's an analogy I like to use, in a POW camp, I mean, you can try to make the best deal for yourself to make your life easier. You can try being nice to the guards. You can try having a relationship with a less savage guard, you know, get married. You can try dressing up if you have the financial resources to be less of a target for violence. You can try having sex with a lot of guards and all that, but you're still a prisoner, and you're only doing all those things to make being in prison bearable, or to make it feel like you're not really in prison. He's one of the good guards. So prisoners can make these decisions, oppressed people can make these decisions, but they all occur in the context of being in prison. So we recognize that this prison is the systematic way that society is structured, and women need to break out of the prison, which means abandoning allegiance to men, the guards, and prioritizing all women, the prisoners, over any man. And that's, we don't recognize that kind of abandonment is nonviolent direct action. That is what the prisoners can do to rebel, is abandon allegiance to the guards. I mean, there's more to it than that, but the way you break out of the prison is, you know, remember the Great Escape? They had an escape committee. There were people who were in charge. There were some people who got rid of the dirt when they were digging tunnels. There were some people who did other stuff. There, you know, you don't just make a mass break as a mob, because everybody gets killed then, rather than maybe just a few people getting killed in an organized effort. So the tyranny of structurelessness is what happens when you make that mass break, and instead of the greatest good for the greatest number, helping all women as a class to escape from that oppression, you have a few people who make deals with the guards, or you have a few people who try to then turn around and take the only thing they know, which is oppression, and apply it to other women. The tyranny of structurelessness, you know, and I was privileged enough to talk to Joe Freeman about this recently, and we talked about that. One of the first things she says is that if you don't implement a structure will form anyway. And if you take the military metaphor further, there are two things that are clear. One is that, you know, officers go to officer candidate school, they're trained, and they can't emerge as an elite because they're responsible. You know, if the system is working properly, they're responsible to their mission as officers, to their responsibilities as officers, to taking care of their people, to being responsible for their people. So that's one thing. A structure actually is counter to elitism, because it doesn't allow bullies, if it's working properly, it doesn't allow bullies to emerge and just take over. And the other thing is that one of the things, and again, this is, you know, taking from military metaphors, which I know many people find uncomfortable, but when soldiers are trained in SEER, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, when they're trained in resistance, you know, to resist being prisoners, one of the things they're trained at is to just keep saying no. And I know Lierre, among other people, is fond of saying that if we could encapsulate feminism in one word, it would be no. And they just say no, you know, when they're asked for information, when they're tortured, whatever has happened to them, they say no, and they keep saying no. And
right, I'm gonna butt in now and get just say one thing and then go back to Lierre. A thing that I was thinking when I was reading The Tyranny of Structurelessness is that it's good for Women's Declaration International that we've got the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which gives us some political structure, sort of ideological structure, that everybody who has read the declaration and signed it, which we all have, and we're working towards it, are basing our efforts. At least we know what we want, and we've got quite a clear outline of what we would like to see, which is we want the UN commitments on women's rights to be implemented, and that roots us in 40 years of international women's struggle. to get those mechanisms in place. And it also roots us in international law. Like 157 countries have signed and ratified and say they should be doing those women's rights. So we're sort of rooted in reality, and it gives us like, unlike some parts of the women's movement where there isn't an ideological structure, we just don't know where they are, which is in fact most organizations haven't laid out what they're up to. But so that's a point about a good thing about having a document like we've got in WDI. Okay, back to Lierre for more comments.
I was struck by this quote from there where she says, the characteristics prerequisite for participating in the informal elites of the movement, and thus for exercising power, concern one's background, personality, or allocation of time. They do not include one's competence, dedication to feminism, talents, or potential contribution to the movement. And here's the key thing. The former are the criteria one usually uses in determining one's friends. The latter are what any movement or organization has to use if it is going to be politically effective. And I think this is part of the problem, is this whole, women are socialized to be nice thing. So we feel mean, trying to assert some boundaries in our groups or trying to figure out how to actually be effective, because it's not going to include everybody. And there are times when we're actually going to have to pitch women out. I mean, I decided when I was, I don't know, at some point in my early 30s, I had finally had enough. And I thought, I'm never actually going to join another group if they don't already have a process to get rid of somebody who's destructive. If there's not a process to remove a bad member, I'm not doing it anymore, because I was so tired of it. And that is, I've never turned back from that. Like, that is so important to be able to protect your group from that. But it is a very hard thing for women to do because of how we're socialized. And the other thing I want to say is that, we have some good reasons for being worried about structure, because it has very often meant hierarchy. And there's a whole workshop that I did about leadership, developing yourself as a leader and developing leadership in whatever group you're in. And I didn't make this up. This is something that I cribbed from another book. And the hard part is that the people who really do understand leadership are groups that we don't like, that we are very averse to. And I speak here of the military and of corporations. They are the people who really understand how to develop leadership. So again, we sort of have to pirate, because they've got good ideas about it. We don't tend to look to them for information. But anyway, I didn't make this up, but these are the different types of leadership. And the first one is coercive power, and that's based on fear. And that's the one we're all worried about for very good reason. This is why I think a lot of women radical feminists have a really knee-jerk reaction against even the word leadership. Is because of that. We all have been victims of that coercive power, across the culture, across society, and it is based on fear, and we don't want it. We're radical feminists because we hate that. The problem is that's not the only kind of leadership. That's just one kind. And the other kind they list here are connective power. So that's based on your links to other people. Expert power, that's your skills and your knowledge that you've developed. Information power, that's based on your access to information. Legitimate power, that's based on an earned position. Referent power, that's based on your personal traits. And reward power, and that's based on pay, promotion, recognition of some kind. And all of those are perfectly legitimate. And if we can learn to cultivate those in ourselves and each other, we'll have a much stronger movement. But we kind of have to get over that, that original repulsion that we have when we talk about things like structure and hierarchy, which is to acknowledge that there's real reasons for that emotional reaction, but we have to lay that aside and really think about what's actually best for the movement.
Yeah, leaders are responsible to the people they lead. It's not like, it's not leadership. I get to make all the decisions and decide what we're going to do. It's a rational strategy of what will accomplish our mission, and our mission is the liberation of women. And leaders are responsible to their people. There's a discussion going on now, about what about women who have children, especially women who have sons. Well, that's an issue. We need to discuss it, and that's an issue. But if you're going to lead a movement, that discussion needs to be focused on what does that do for all of us? What does that do for our movement? What does that do for the liberation of women? If the liberation of women is somehow impacted negatively by women having sons, we need to talk about that. And it's something that women who want to have kids have to think about and deal with. And nobody can tell them, well, you can't do this with your body, you can't do that with your body. That's not what we're saying. But there needs to be some acknowledgement, and leadership needs to know that the decisions that we make, impact our mission, which is the liberation of all women as a class.
One of the things I would add, and then maybe we'll go to Sheila, is that I think that the suffragettes in Britain in the early 20th century were the Women's Social and Political Union under Emmeline Pankhurst were very, very clear. They just had one goal, which is votes for women. And they said, look, we're in a war against the men who are not giving it to us. We've got to use, and they used non-violent direct action and sort of used a range of different techniques that, as one didn't work, as discussion, asking, they were very, very clear about it. But they actually, it's interesting that Pankhurst said, we don't have a structure. It's just, she set it up and she ran it with her two daughters. And they're very, very clear. They just want votes for women. It's a single issue. Just get involved if you want to, do something else if you don't. And she was, very friendly with the other organizations who did other things. But it actually worked. And that was a good thing. So I think we can learn quite a lot by, it might be nice to talk about some of these issues, but personally, I feel like we should continue to really think about what's going to actually work and do it, rather than sometimes some of these discussions maybe can happen. They can happen, but I'm much more into actually achieving our political objectives. But let's go to Sheila again. Oh, and you're still, sorry.
Yeah.
You're on mute, yeah.
In terms of the suffragettes, yes, they were very much one issue, but of course they were usually dominated by spinsters, in fact, not just Emmeline. But they weren't creating the theory and practice of a movement, as it were. They were very much single issue. I'm not sure that we are with the WDI. Our declaration covers a very wide range of women's issues, and we are involved with women working on all of these. So it is a bit different. It also should be pointed out that in 1978, I, with a lot of other women, were on the South Bank in London protesting a celebration of 50 years of the vote. 1978, 50 years of the vote. We protested. We were dressed in suffragette costume. My little banner, we weren't allowed to have banners, which I brought out, said, "The vote is a con, male power goes on." So we were not tremendously enthusiastic. And we also, at one banner said, "All men are wankers," said Christabel Pankhurst, and so on. So we had a great time. But so I think single issue is not exactly where we are now. We have certain absolutely crucial things like the transvestite rights movement. And obviously we're opposing them, and our discussion of non-violence was in relation to all of that and the absolute emergency that we're in. But I don't think just relating to what the suffragettes were doing will necessarily help us here.
Right, well, we've got 1 minute left. So either Marian or Lierre to add something.
For those of you in the United States, we're doing a training next weekend in Tacoma, Washington. And the training also involves going right back out into that square, and we are doing the protests all over again. They are not going to stop us. We're head on, we're doing it again. So
Lierre, how do we
get? If you want more information, just find me. I'll tell you all about it, or you can go to Sovereign Women Speak. April is the one who's organizing it. Sovereign Women Speak.
Okay, Sovereign Women Speak.
And Carrie Dance is going to be there too. So
brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay, look, this has been absolutely fantastic. And I think that we often have very theoretical and quite sort of calm discussions about books and things like that, which are fantastic and they're really helpful. But I felt like today we are like full of energy and we're making significant, serious sort of breakthroughs. We're thinking about what we're going to be doing as a movement, and there's a lot to carry on discussing. So send emails in to Lierre, me on info@Women's Declaration, or Lierre via Wolf or Sovereign Women Speak. We'll keep going on this. And there's a breakout room now. So go to that, and anything that comes out of it, let's just keep working on it. And hopefully we can sort of move forward in a really positive way. So Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. And and yes, see you next week. We've got talk on our blood. I've posted it in the chat, so you'll see it. Okay, bye everyone.